Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Smart Talk, which is the Henry George School's series of interviews with some of today's leading economists, finance officials, and public policy makers. My name is Josh Vincent, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Economics in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And today's guest on Smart Talk is Rick Rybeck, executive director of Just Economics LLC. And that's a consultancy that helps communities harmonize economic development, public policy objectives for job creation, affordable housing, and sustainable development. But before we start talking about the intersection of affordable housing, job creation, and traffic congestion, I want to reflect upon what's been flooding our TVs and computer screens lately. Increasingly, we hear bad news about a divided country. There's runaway opioid deaths, multitudes of hate speech and hate crimes, and generally a lot of angst out there. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what Rick knows well, we think it would be good if we looked from a higher plane of where we're coming from. And essentially, we just want to ask Rick, what's going on out there?
Well, I think this is a good place to start. And I think as I look at what's going on, I have friends who are pro-Trump, I have friends who are anti-Trump, and sometimes they're talking about the same situation, but if you didn't know that, there's no way you could connect the fact that they're talking about the same situation. Their views are so opposite. And how did we get in this place? Well, I think that both parties have failed the public. Both parties have used language in very misleading ways. And this makes it difficult for ordinary people to understand why the economy is doing either well or poorly, and what, if anything, they can do about it.
Let's see if we can expand on that, if you could drive it up to a bigger picture.
Right. Well, I think historically, both Democrats and Republicans have described our economy as if we were living in Jeffersonian times. They emphasize small farmers and small entrepreneurs in a very competitive environment. And certainly, we have lots of those small farmers and small entrepreneurs, but increasingly, they are overshadowed by multinational corporations that can influence both supply and demand for their products. Mm-hmm. And neither party addresses the role that large corporations play, both in our economy and our politics. As a result, some people say that we're in bad shape because the market is failing. And other people say, oh, we're in bad shape because the government is failing. And some take these positions to the extreme so that markets are always good and the government is always bad, or vice versa. And in reality, both markets and governments are complex. And in some cases, businesses and governments are so closely integrated that this false dichotomy between markets and government becomes ludicrous. I mean, in some cases, government action can actually enhance the efficiency and fairness of markets. But most politicians haven't developed the patience or vocabulary to explain what's going on. I think when the economy crashed in 2008, President Bush didn't even have the vocabulary to describe what was happening. And when his advisors told him that he needed to bail out some of the large banks and financial institutions, this resulted in some rather strange headlines. I'm thinking of a couple that read George Bush, socialist. Yeah. Well, you know, these headlines showed that the writers didn't understand either George Bush or socialism. But when we don't have a vocabulary to talk about what's going on, that kind of misunderstanding becomes rampant. And it leads to both frustration, and that encourages simplistic black or white perspectives. Some commentators say that markets are always good and that government's always bad. Some say the opposite. I think in reality, the world is a much more complex and nuanced place.
Well, I certainly agree. And so I guess then it behooves me to ask you, what are some good examples of the market failing or government failing?
Well, thanks. Good question. I think markets are fantastic when they work, but they don't always work. In the agricultural market, for example, if you have pure competition, and because of the time lag related to both harvest and planting seasons, this can lead to dynamic economic disequilibrium. I mean, typically we talk about competition leading to an equilibrium between supply and demand. But in competitive agriculture, where no farmer can influence the price, each farmer's incentive is to produce as much as possible to maximize their income. Of course, this can often lead to overproduction and falling prices. As a result of the overproduction and falling prices during the next planting cycle, a lot of farmers say, well, that was a big loser. I'm not going to plant that anymore. And they either don't plant or they switch to some other commodity. This leads to shortages in the first commodity that was overproduced the season before. And as time goes on, supply and demand become more and more out of sync. Not surprisingly, agriculture is heavily regulated and subsidized to help avoid dynamic disequilibrium that a free market can produce. So that's one example of market failure and how the government can be helpful. An example of government failure, in my view, others might disagree, is the large amount of low-density single-use zoning. In places where there's lots of land and low demand for buildings and easy transportation, this might not be a problem. But in areas where you have high demand for housing and commercial space, excessive zoning for low density inflates land prices. And this makes life very hard for both residents and businesses. Single-use zoning makes it difficult to walk to the corner store because corner stores aren't allowed. So as a result, almost every activity outside the home requires an automobile trip. And car trips and parking take up huge amounts of space. This creates traffic congestion in spite of relatively low densities. So, I think that some significant consequences of economic action, and this is going back to sort of how the market fails, some significant consequences of economic action are not subject to market transactions. And a common example of this is pollution. A company makes a product, and to do this, they must pay for raw materials and labor and equipment, and they hope at the end of the day, the price they get for what they're producing exceeds the costs. But if you go back in history, companies could dump their waste products into the air or the water at no price. Doing this killed fish and animals and plants and people. But because the companies didn't have to pay for the injuries and illnesses that they created, their ability to pollute the air and the water for free artificially lowered their cost of production. So government intervention was necessary to correct this market failure. Now, we can argue whether a particular government intervention is effective, or efficient, or fair. And we can argue whether they could be improved or perhaps even redesigned. But clearly, in the case of pollution, the free market wasn't going to solve that problem. And this, I guess, gives me a segue into sort of what the initial or original topic for our discussion is, dealing with infrastructure and bridging our divide. Well, infrastructure is typically something that the private sector cannot provide or provide well, and there's some reasons for that. First, things that we typically think of infrastructure, like street lights or sidewalks, those types of things, have some unique characteristics that make it difficult for private businesses to provide effectively. So, for example, think about a street light. One person's enjoyment or consumption of the street light at night does not diminish the supply of light for other people in that vicinity. In other words, if I'm walking at night and getting the benefit of the street light, my utilization of the light doesn't diminish the quantity or quality of light available to others on that same segment of sidewalk. But in terms of excludability, again, sticking with street lights, it's difficult to exclude people from enjoying the street light if they haven't paid for it. So, for example, imagine a segment of sidewalk, and there are doors that open onto the sidewalk from homes and businesses, and at each end of the sidewalk segment, it's joined to other segments of sidewalk. So where would you put a toll booth to collect user fees from pedestrians. I mean, people are coming and going, and there's no way to keep track of who's paid or who hasn't. And if you tried to intercept every pedestrian at every possible place of entering that segment of sidewalk, it would be very impractical and cumbersome. So for those two reasons, certain types of goods like streetlights are perhaps efficiently provided by the public sector rather than the private sector. And government intervention might be appropriate or inappropriate in terms of how we provide streetlights, and it might be good or bad or both. But I don't think there's a blanket way of knowing until we analyze the particulars of any situation.
You mentioned infrastructure, which really is the meat of what's going on in this country and in this discussion. The candidates in 2016, Trump and Clinton, didn't agree on much. I think we would agree almost nothing. But they both agreed strongly that the country needed more infrastructure investment. In spite of this agreement, there hasn't been much progress anywhere. What's your take on the situation? Why?
Well, I think there's a reason that many people are not enthusiastic about spending tax dollars for infrastructure, in spite of the fact that almost everybody agrees that we need it. I mean, labor groups, Chamber of Commerce, I mean, everybody agrees, and yet, as you said, very little happens. And yet, I think there are reasons. I don't know that people can articulate it, but I'll give it a shot. So let's say a politician comes to us and says, you know, Rick, you should pay a tax to create some infrastructure. And I'll tell you why. You need to pay for this infrastructure because it's going to create jobs. I think, okay, so I pay my tax. And when the infrastructure has been completed, assuming that it was well designed and well built, the price of nearby land goes up. And developers go to the politicians and say, you know, we would love to develop near this new infrastructure. It might be a new road or a new transit. But gosh, you know, land prices are too high for us to make any money. We really need a tax abatement if we're going to be successful in developing near the infrastructure. So now the politicians come back to me and say, oh, Rick, you need to fund a tax abatement so that these developers can pay the high land costs and create the jobs that were supposed to be created by your initial investment in the new infrastructure. So now I've got to pay a second time in tax abatements to get this benefit that the politicians first promised me. And now that the infrastructure has been created and some developers have put up some new buildings, well, if I want to take advantage of that infrastructure that I've paid for to the maximum, I probably want to have my home or my business next to that new highway interchange or next to the transit stop. So I go to the landlord who's got that new building, shiny new building there, and I say, here's my first month's rent. And the landlord looks at the fistful of dollars I'm holding up and smiles at me and says, well, that would rent you a place anywhere else in the region, but hey, you're right next to the new fill in the blank, the new interchange, the new transit stop. You've got to pay a premium rent to locate because this is a very valuable place. So just to recap, I have to pay taxes to create the infrastructure. Then I have to pay tax abatements to developers, and then I have to pay a rent premium. So I have to pay 2 or even 3 times just to get the benefit of this infrastructure I probably only wanted to pay for once. So when you think about it that way, no wonder people aren't very enthusiastic about paying for infrastructure. It kind of bites them in the rear end. So, you know, we shouldn't have to pay 2 or 3 times to get the benefit that we theoretically should only have to pay for once.
And if I calculate correctly, that's 2 public taxes and 1 private levy, a private tax that goes into the landlord's pockets.
Yeah, it seems that way. Yeah, I mean, the first payment goes to the government to create the infrastructure.
Sure.
And then the tax abatement and the rent premium are both kind of payments to the landowner, if you will. I mean, the tax abatement seems to be going to the developer, but in effect, it's really so the developer can afford to pay off the landlord or the landowner who's asking a higher price.
Okay, so I think you made a pretty clear case. So can you talk more about how rising land prices actually undermine infrastructure's intended benefits.
Well, I think you're right. It always helps to have a little story or example rather than just talking in theory. And Winston Churchill, I think, gave a great example. I think in the early 1900s, he was addressing Parliament in London, and he spoke about a poor neighborhood in London where the workers had to pay a toll to get to their jobs that were on the other side of the river. And when the public became aware of this, they thought, well, this is terribly unfair to force these poor working class people to pay a toll to get to their jobs. It would be so helpful to these people if they didn't have to pay the toll. So government, trying to be responsive and be good government, they made the bridge free. But within a very short time after making the bridge free, rents within this low-income neighborhood went up by the amount of the foregone toll, because now it was more valuable to live here now that you didn't have to pay the toll. So the public tax dollars that were intended to benefit the workers ended up enriching the landowners instead. And workers who had to go across the bridge ended up no better off than before. They were paying less on the bridge, but now they were paying more in rent.
Yeah.
And if they lived in this neighborhood and didn't use the bridge, well, they were just worse off because they were paying higher rent and getting nothing in return.
Yeah.
So that's one case of how this situation where infrastructure creates these higher land values ends up creating a situation in which, to use a cliche, no good deed goes unpunished. Another example, and this is a little bit more broad,
right.
Deals with what we often talk about in land use. We talk about problems related to urban sprawl. And when we think about urban infrastructure, whether it's streets or transit or water and sewer lines, what have you, typically we create this infrastructure to facilitate development. But if this infrastructure is well designed and well built, it makes land prices around that new infrastructure go up, which means that people who want to locate near the infrastructure, assuming they can't get a tax abatement, say, gee, I'd love to be here, but I can't afford it. So they develop on cheaper but more remote land. So now development happens away from the infrastructure instead of next to it. And when the people move into this new development that's far away, they say, hey, Mr. Politician, we need more infrastructure. The politicians, being the good people that they are, say, oh, yeah, you guys need infrastructure. So they extend the road and the water and the transit to this new place, even though there's plenty of capacity where it was originally provided. And as soon as they do this, the cycle starts over again. Land prices go up, choke off development, and development moves into the next cornfield. And this sprawl is not only bad for the environment, but it's bad for our pocketbooks as well, because now we have much more infrastructure at great expense than would be required if development was more compact.
Interesting. And of course, commuting can kill you. Last few decades, the academic literature on transit financing, building these systems that the good citizens want from good politicians, has centered around the phrase value capture. And I understand that you are rejecting that terminology. So what does that mean to policymakers and elected officials? What is your thinking and your analysis of what value capture, quote unquote, actually means and entails?
Well, before I talk about what it means to politicians, I'll try to talk about what it means to everyday folks. And in its purest form, value capture simply means value given for value received. So in a private sector example, if I give you a hamburger, you give me something in return. It might be money, it might be something else that I need and feel is of equal value. So in its broadest sense, that's what value capture is. Well, since the 1970s, some folks have used the term value capture in the context of public infrastructure. And what they mean is, well, as we just mentioned, a lot of types of public infrastructure lead to higher land values. And this typically ends up as a windfall profit to whoever is lucky or shrewd enough to own well-served land. And value capture was primarily intended as a term to use to describe having the public sector receive some of that land value that it creates in the first place. But there are a couple reasons why I don't use the term. First of all, I don't think most people know what we're talking about when we say value capture. I think, although some academics have been talking about it, I don't think most people do. Second, to some people, the term capture sounds aggressive and mean. I was working on a project for the UN a few years ago on this topic, and they say, oh, we don't use that term value capture because a lot of people in various parts of the world thought it sounded too aggressive and mean-spirited. So it didn't seem to work at that level. Right. And finally, the reason I don't use the term anymore, or at least as little as I can, is because a lot of these so-called experts who use the term have been misusing it. Mm-hmm. So, for example, some so-called public finance experts refer to development impact fees as value capture. Well, development impact fees are typically based on the value of buildings, not the value of land. And this fee is imposed to reimburse the public sector for infrastructure costs created by new development. So this is really cost reimbursement rather than value capture. And that might seem like a nuance, but it results in some very significant differences in terms of economic incentives that face economic actors like developers or people who want to live or in housing or rent commercial space. And so this kind of misuse of the language creates confusion. Similarly with tax increment financing. A lot of people talk about tax increment financing as value capture. In reality, in most schemes, the people who own land in a tax increment financing district pay the same taxes they would if the district didn't exist. The only difference is some of the tax they're paying goes into a special dedicated fund. Well, I would call this revenue segregation rather than value capture. So, as I indicated, I've abandoned that term value capture because A, people don't understand it, B, people think it's mean, and C, some people have used it to describe stuff that really isn't value capture. So for all these reasons, I've come up with a new term, which I hope is easier to understand and perhaps more self-explanatory. Mm-hmm. What I say is we need to employ land value return and recycling. So when I say land value return, that's because the public sector is creating this land value, so returning it simply means giving it back to the people who created it in the first place. There's a certain reciprocity there, which I think hopefully has a good connotation. And people tend to like the term recycling. And what that simply means is once that publicly created land value comes back to the public sector, it gets reused to maintain and operate the infrastructure that created the value in the first place. So it gets returned and recycled. And in this way, it can help make infrastructure financially self-sustaining, if not completely, at least to a greater extent than it is today.
Very logical. If you can change the language, you've won quite a few battles and wars in the U.S. and over the world. So that's sort of, yeah.
I think the key thing here is that there's so few people using the term value capture that we don't have to worry about inventing a new term. This is going to be new for most people who hear about it. So why not use a term that's a little bit easier to understand and maybe a little bit more self-explanatory?
I quite agree. Again, that's the attack of jargonese in the professions. And being clearer in the language, as you've been stressing, is very important. I've read your writings in the past on such issues in history. I know people might not like history, but it's very instructive.
Well, there are actually some examples of land value return and recycling that have been successful that I'm familiar with. And I could talk about those briefly.
Just a few examples, yeah.
Sure. So the first one deals with streets and sidewalks, what we started off talking about initially. In the 1890s, most of the streets in Washington, D.C. were unpaved. So dry weather was very dusty and hard to breathe. And then when it was raining, like it is today, people would be tracking dust, mud, and manure into homes and places of businesses. So when Congress decided to pave the streets, they could have paid for it out of general funds, but they said, no, we will only pay half the cost out of general funds.
Right.
The other half will be assessed against the landowners who own land adjacent to a newly paved street or sidewalk. Now, the person who owns this land, they might live in Philadelphia, they might live in New York City or somewhere else. They might never walk on this street or sidewalk. Yeah. But yet, because this street or sidewalk will make it easier for everyone to get around and stop people from tracking dust, mud, and manure into their property, it will inflate the value of their property, their land, and therefore it would be appropriate for these landowners to pay a special fee because they're getting a special benefit, just above and beyond the benefit that everybody gets from cleaner air and easier transportation. So 50% of the first-time paving of streets and sidewalks was paid for by adjacent property owners. That's, I think, a successful example of land value return and recycling. Another case, perhaps even more dramatic, but also from the same time period, the 1890s, is the Chevy Chase streetcar. The Chevy Chase Land Company bought about 1,700 acres of land on the DC-Maryland border. This is to the northwest of the downtown area where the Capitol and the White House are. And they bought this land on both sides of the DC and Maryland border. And the land, when they bought it, was very cheap. Why was it cheap? Well, it was mostly farm and forest land. Right. And it's cheap because there was no way to get from these parcels to the downtown, which is where the jobs and the shopping were. At their own expense, they then built a streetcar line from the downtown area out to their land. And they charged people a few pennies to ride the streetcar. Now, charging people a few pennies to ride the streetcar, of course, we're talking about the 1890s, that may have been enough to pay for the salary of the conductor and the ticket taker. But probably, in fact, I'm almost sure it was not enough to cover the cost of the streetcars and the railroad tracks.
Likely not.
So was this an act of charity or altruism? Absolutely not. The Chevy Chase Land Company, they made their money back on this investment, not from the fare box, but because the price of land that they had bought cheaply went way up, because now it was very easy to get to downtown where the jobs and shopping existed. And as a result, when they were reselling this land for home lots and building lots, right, they got a lot more money from that land because of the nearby streetcar. So, and it's interesting when you think about this, because a lot of times people, and we'll talk about this maybe later, people who talk about market urbanism, if you will. A lot of people say, oh, we should finance infrastructure solely on user fees. Well, when you think about a streetcar or a transit line, what's the user fee? Well, that's the fare that the rider pays.
Yeah.
Well, if the Chevy Chase Land Company had tried to recoup all of its costs through the fare box, well, the fare to ride that streetcar would have been astronomical, and few, if anybody, would have ridden the streetcar. And if people don't ride the streetcar, well, then both the streetcar project would have failed and the land development project would have failed also. So what Chevy Chase Land Company did was they got the right balance between the fare box, the user fee, and land value return, which, if you kind of think about it in everyday language, kind of like an access fee. So user fees and access fees need to be in balance, and I think the Chevy Chase streetcar accomplished that. And then in the more, if our viewers are tired of thinking, well, that's all ancient history, what about life today? Well, a good example of land value return and recycling in today's world is transit in Hong Kong. So a lot of people think of Hong Kong as kind of the motherland of capitalism. particularly before China took it over, but even since then, it continues to be a hub for international business and entrepreneurialism. But what's surprising is, to some people at least, is that all the land in Hong Kong is owned by Hong Kong. And so when infrastructure improves in Hong Kong, when people's land lease ends, their rents go up. And so the value of the infrastructure, instead of being a windfall to landowner, comes back to Hong Kong. And in the case of Hong Kong Transit, before the transit was created, Hong Kong sold some of the land adjacent to and above the subway stops to the transit authority at pre-subway prices. Once the subway was there, and this becomes very much like the Chevy Chase example, that land was much more valuable. So the transit authority didn't sell that land, but they lease it to developers on 99-year leases, if you will. And so you have huge buildings on top of and next to the subway stations. And those buildings are privately owned, but those owners are paying rent to the transit authority for the right to be in that very valuable location. So one of the things that's interesting about Hong Kong Transit is a lot of people, if you ask about transit, they say, oh yeah, transit by definition has to be subsidized. It doesn't make money. But Hong Kong is one of the few, if not the only transit authorities in the world that actually makes a profit. And they make a profit because Hong Kong is dense, so providing transit is very efficient and economical. But part of the reason they make a profit is they're collecting huge rents, value that other transit authorities create as well, but which ends up getting siphoned off to private landowners, comes back to the transit authority, and they recycle that to operate, maintain, and improve the transit system. So I think these are some examples that show that land value return on recycling, it can be used by the private sector, as it was with the Chevy Chase streetcar example. It can be used by the public sector, as it was in terms of creating new streets or in terms of Hong Kong Transit. But when it's used, it can be a powerful tool to make infrastructure financially self-sustaining.
And just to make clear to our viewers, you're saying that in Hong Kong, there is no private market per se in land. There's no changing of ownership. It's owned by the public sector.
That's my understanding. I'm not an expert on Hong Kong. And it's possible that if you have let's say a 99-year lease on a piece of land, perhaps you can sell, let's say 50 years have gone by, you can sell perhaps the remaining term of your lease to somebody else. But they, again, what they're getting is the right to occupy that land for the remainder of the lease, whether it's 50 or 60 or 49 years, whatever. And at the end of that lease term, both the land and whatever buildings are on that land revert to Hong Kong. Now, of course, at the end of the lease, Hong Kong may decide to renew the lease, but then that's a negotiation that takes place. And as we discussed earlier, if the value of land has become more valuable because of what the public sector has done, and assuming they've got good negotiators, they'll negotiate an increase in rent for the next cycle so that publicly created land value comes back to the public sector that created it. Right now, I mean, we end up in this country, it's kind of, let's think about you're on the street corner and you see a guy, he's got raggedy clothes and he's got his hat out and he's begging for money. And you think, oh, this poor fellow, I should give him some money because he's having a tough time. And just as you're about to walk up to him, a big limo steps out, a guy in a tuxedo steps out, and the guy who was begging gives him all the cash he's collected throughout the day. The guy in the tuxedo gets back in the limo and drives off. And now you're thinking, well, do I want to give money to this guy who's giving money away? Well, in some sense, that's what our public sector is like today in this country. The public sector creates enormous amounts of land value through streets and water and sewer and transit, all these other public goods and services that it provides, schools, creates enormous amounts of value. But then it gives that value away largely to a few people who are lucky or shrewd enough to own the best served land, and then says, oh, we're broke, and they've always got their hand out. But in the meantime, they're giving all this value away. So I think the lesson for us is that we need to realize that this value is being created by the public sector, and it should be, out of a sense of fairness, if you will, returned to the entity that created it so that the public sector can be financially self-sustaining. And if that were the case, as in Hong Kong, then taxes on labor and capital could be lower, and that would be good for residents and businesses alike.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic. I think many people note that a country that is now run by putatively communist nation of China has the freest market and the most unleashed economy in the world. So that's really interesting. It's due to a result of the public sector getting its stuff back, its value back.
And in a way, you can think of it in a private sector context, which is they're getting a fair return on value that they're creating. I mean, it's like the hamburger situation. Instead of giving the hamburger away for free and then going to somebody else and say, oh, I'm broke, you got to give me some money, they're giving hamburgers to people, and the people who get the hamburgers have to pay them for it. In this case, it's transit, not a hamburger.
So it's funny. That leads me to ask you a question that's burbling these days in discussions of urban politics and economics. We talked about it a little bit earlier, and that's the school of thought about city policy with the new catchphrase market urbanism. Many of their arguments assert that public services, as we discussed a little earlier, and I'd like to touch on that more, that public services ought to be funded by the user of the services, either at the fare box or by casting a wide net revenue with the regional local sales tax. The one was just defeated by the voters in the Atlanta area. What is your reaction to that? Do you think there's a better or more ethical way? And I think you sort of hinted that there is.
We did talk a little bit about market urbanism earlier, and I think a good way to start, again, to avoid jargon, just use everyday language, is that when a city or a state or even the federal government, when they create public goods and services, many beneficiaries exist, and all the beneficiaries should pay their fair share of the cost based on the benefits they receive or based on costs that they impose upon others. Now, traditional user fees like roadway tolls, parking fees, transit fares can accomplish these goals, at least in part. Mm-hmm. But as we talked about in terms of the Chevy Chase streetcar, unless these user fees were astronomically high, they would not be enough to pay for all the costs associated with either streets or transit or schools or what have you. Mm-hmm. So fortunately, there are other beneficiaries other than their direct users. And a prime example of this, owners of land near new streets or near new schools or near new transit. These landowners get a huge benefit, and they don't benefit from using the infrastructure like driving on the street or riding in the subway. They benefit by controlling and charging rent for access to the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. That's why I think before I referred to it as an access fee as opposed to a user fee. And as mentioned previously, it makes sense for landowners to pay for infrastructure access benefits. A fee based on land value accomplishes this and does so in such a way that each landowner pays in proportion to the benefits that they receive. This seems kind of fair. Mm-hmm. So it's also worth noting that, and I think we talked about this before too, that there's a relationship between the traditional user fee and access fees or land value return. So in other words, if we create a wonderful new transit system and charge no fare, well then land around the transit system goes up in value by a whole lot. But after having done this, let's say I change my mind and I decide to impose a fare, or if I allow the quality or quantity of service to decline. So this is increasing the user fee or letting the the value of the service decline, well, then the access fees go down. So as user fees go up, access fees go down and vice versa. So free transit means high land value, high user fees mean low land value. If I reduce the quantity or quality of service, that will drop land values also. So there's that relationship between user fees and access fees. And again, I think, a lot of people in our world today who can't wrap their head around the complexity of the world, they tend to be bombastic and say, oh, it's all this or it's all that. And in this case, it's really important to try to get the balance right, like they did with the Chevy Chase streetcar. If you make the streetcar free, well, maybe it gets abused because people don't value the service. Riders would abuse it and it would be overcrowded a lot of time. On the other hand, if you overcharge, then nobody rides it, and then it just becomes a wasted investment. So to get the balance right between user fees and access fees, it's efficient and it's fair. So I'm hoping that by including land value return and recycling, and that's often missing, but including that along with traditional user fees, we can help make budgets work and also reduce taxes that increase the cost of housing commercial locations. I think in your opening remark, you talked about sales taxes. Some people say, oh, yeah, we should use a sales tax as kind of a surrogate user fee, if you will. And sales taxes do make some sense. They exist in part because government actually makes retail sales possible in several ways. First, there's the enforcement of contracts. I mean, without the enforcement of contracts and the court system, and without transportation infrastructure that makes delivery of goods possible, it would be very difficult for retail sales to take place. So certainly, even if somebody stays in their house and they order online, they never use the streets and they never use the court system. Right. But by buying stuff online or even by going to a store, they're getting the benefit of the court system, the transportation system. So yeah, a sales tax makes sense in that way. But it's also true, particularly for transportation infrastructure, that some places benefit more than others. And a sales tax simply fails to capture those unequal benefits. So the value of the sales tax is there, and it's fair to some extent, but its role should be limited. It's not the be-all and end-all. And so I'm in favor of market urbanism as long as we don't forget about the land market. And I'm not opposed to, and this may be a contrast with some people who are market urbanists. Again, if they feel, oh, all government regulation is bad, I don't put myself in that category. I think some government regulation makes sense. But again, we have to evaluate that on the individual circumstances to know whether those regulations are fair, efficient, or effective to accomplish important public purposes.
So as you've noted earlier in the discussion, landowners as a species or a group receive a financial windfall when public goods and services enhance the value of land. Most people, I think, can figure that out. When you put in an interstate exchange in a cow field, it turns into a shopping mall. But some people have said that land speculation is a good thing. After all, people who invest in land, right, they take a risk, they roll that dice. Capitalism rewards risk. So what's wrong with that? Why shouldn't landowners receive a windfall like they always have?
Well, I'm glad you asked this question because it really circles back to something we started talking about at the very top of our discussion, which is the misuse of language. And I've run into this argument before, people who say, oh, land speculation is a good thing. And one of the reasons they say is a lot of times we don't use the term land speculator or land speculation. We talk about, well, these people are real estate investors. And what's wrong with investing in real estate? Well, if you look at the economic definition of investment or investing means to forego immediate consumption and to use the accumulated savings to create something new that will enhance not something new that you consume, but something that will enhance future production of other stuff. So investing would include things like making a machine that makes other machines, or creating a building, not that you would eat that building, but you hope that that building will be used by others, either as a place to live or work, and they'll pay more in rent than it costs to produce the building and maintain the building. So those are examples of investment. But when people buy and sell land, what are they creating? Nothing. Buying and selling land creates nothing. It is risky, but so is jumping off Niagara Falls. So is playing Russian roulette. I don't think we want to incentivize either jumping off Niagara Falls or playing Russian roulette simply because they're risky. Nothing good comes from these activities, so we do not incentivize them. Mm-hmm. The same should be true for land speculation, which again is not investment, it's just gambling. And what are people gambling? Well, as we mentioned before, the value of land doesn't come from what the owner produces, it comes from what other people produce. Land value is based on what other people around this piece of land do to make it an attractive place to live or work, or both. So essentially, gambling on increases in land value, A, it creates nothing, and B, it's a parasitic activity because you're making money off of other people's work. Mm-hmm. So the next thing that people say who say, well, land speculation is a good thing, they say, well, land speculators perform an important function because they prevent the premature development of land. To put it another way, because land speculators buy land and then hold it for future appreciation, there's vacant land available when at some time in the future, that land requires more productive uses than are required today. Well, this is, to use an indelicate term, BS. I'm sure that some of our listeners have seen buildings that after a period of time are expanded, right? People add a wing or they add a floor. Or in other cases, they've seen buildings that are bought, torn down, and new buildings put up in their place. In other words, when the economy changes and a piece of land becomes more valuable in a new use than its current use, investors may either expand the building or tear it down and build a new one. We don't need to reserve vacant land to facilitate progress. And so this notion that we need to reserve land for the future is a bit of a myth. And as I said, the value of land doesn't come from what the owners does, it comes from what other people do. So the ability under today's system, where we do very little land value return and recycling, basically we allow landowners to appropriate value that's created both by their neighbors and by the public sector in improving their value, value of their land. And this ability to appropriate the value of the work done by other people, this is the fuel for land speculation, a parasitic activity that creates nothing of value. But it actually creates a real artificial scarcity of land available for development at any particular time, primarily in prime locations. And this results in real increases in land prices and drives development to cheaper but more remote locations, as we spoke about earlier. And this is part of the dynamic for sprawl. So if we get away from simply giving land value away, like we do today, and if we allow it to be returned and recycled, we encourage the development of high-value land. And high-value sites are typically infill sites near existing urban infrastructure. So that would be near good schools, near parks, near transit, near the center of road networks. So these are empty spaces in our downtowns, and greater utilization of these infill sites would reduce development pressure on our rural areas, leaving these rural areas available for what they do best, which is agriculture, conservation, and recreation.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting. We know that the cost of sprawl is, of course, costing rural cultures, rural geographies. And I think people don't think about that, except sometimes when they hear a farmer say, well, that 10 acres over there, that's my retirement home in Florida. So they're okay with the speculative aspects, some of them. But wouldn't a system of land value return, as you are describing, be unfair to rural communities?
Well, I think that's a good question. And I think certainly at first blush, a lot of people, especially city people, say, well, what do farmers have except lots of land? And if we change our system of taxation to be based on land value, that's just going to ruin farmers. Certainly, if we have a large area that includes a city and suburban jurisdictions, and if they're going to transition from the existing system to a new system, I would certainly encourage the center of the area to do this first, because whichever area does it first will encourage more development. So if the outer areas did it first, that would encourage more development out there, and really development might be more appropriate in the center. But aside from that, eventually, once the center does it, I think the periphery could do it too. And I think it could work for rural areas because rural land values are so much lower than urban land values. And therefore, land value return should not, if it's correctly designed and implemented, shouldn't create a burden in rural areas. And again, if we encourage development to go to the center first, that will remove some of the development pressure on the rural areas and lower their values and make land value return and recycling more appropriate in rural areas. The other thing, too, to keep in mind is that city folks tend to underestimate the amount of improvement value in rural areas. So, for example, what makes farms valuable a lot of the times is they've got fencing and irrigation and drainage system or terracing on hillsides. Well, these are not natural creations. These are man-made creations. And the property assessor should look at the value created by the fencing and the drainage and the terracing and irrigation. Those should be considered improvement values, not land values. And if they were assessed as improvement values, then again, the land value return and recycling wouldn't be burdensome in a rural area. And it's kind of interesting to note that in the late 1800s, I guess this must be my favorite era of history. I keep going back to that. But rural farmers in Denmark actually petitioned for a tax on land values as a way to protect small farms that were being bought out by large landowners. So very wealthy, large landowners were buying up small farms, putting small farmers out of business, and then they just let the land lie fallow. Well, small farmers and small farms have a lot more outbuildings and improvements than these large estates. So when the land tax was imposed in Denmark, it actually favored the small farmers, and it forced some of the large landholders to sell off their idle land to those smaller landholders. So it helped small farms in those areas. So clearly, I think it needs to be thought through. Like I said, timing is important, doing it in the central area before you do it in the peripheral area. But I think if it's carefully choreographed and thought through, land value return and recycling can work not only for urban areas, but for rural areas as well.
Interesting. I'd like to see you in front of a panel of farmers someday. If you can, we've been speaking really kind of complex A to Z kind of issues, but if you can boil down for the viewing audience, what do you think are the most preferable funding sources for roads and transit? Full stop.
Well, I think, as I said before, I think we need a balance of funding mechanisms. Certainly drivers and transit riders get a direct benefit from using infrastructure, and they should pay reasonable tolls, reasonable parking fees, and reasonable fares. I don't have a problem with that. Of course, people will say, well, what's reasonable? That's another discussion.
Yeah, that's another
but we'll leave it at that. But what's missing today is the fact that landowners are receiving huge financial benefits from infrastructure. And typically, property tax rates vary from place to place, but typically they're between 1 or 2% of value. And if you do what economists call a net present value calculation, that's where you take a stream of payments and collapse it into a one-time payment, like a sales tax.
Right.
You'd find that this 1 or 2% payment that's paid every year, basically, for every $100 of land value that's created by the public, the landowners are paying between 10 and 20% through the property tax.
Mm-hmm.
So basically,
yeah,
we're giving away 80 to 90% of the value created by public infrastructure. And I think if we were more robust in terms of land value return and recycling, infrastructure could be more financially self-sustaining, and the user fees, in other words, the tolls for the drivers and the fares for the transit riders, those could be reasonable because they're getting this return from landowner beneficiaries. And certainly in those cases where transportation authorities own land, say next to a highway interchange or next to a transit station, they can do what they do in Hong Kong. They can do what we call joint development, and that's very helpful. But typically, most transportation agencies own only a very small amount of land, if any, that benefits from the infrastructure they create and maintain. Mm-hmm. And finally, there are advertising and other concessions that can be created. Some people like to put a corporate name on a subway station or put advertising on a bus or in a rail car. That brings in some revenue opportunities.
Sure.
They're not huge, but I don't think you should ignore any opportunity for creating value as long as fair value is received in return. So user fees, certainly their access fees or land value return, that's key because that's missing now. And then these other kinds of advertising and other concession fees are appropriate also. And again, as we said, the key is getting them in the right balance.
That makes sense. And governments today are used to looking for spare change behind the couch anyway. So the concession idea makes a lot of sense. Now, during this discussion, and in some of the articles that you've written and colleagues in your profession have written, you distinguish between taxes and fees, quote unquote. What is the difference? I mean, tell the taxpayer, what's the difference between taxes and fees?
Well, to some people, this may seem like a distinction without a difference, but I think it's important, and I'll tell you why. A tax is kind of a general payment made for a general benefit. So, for example, you might pay for a tax that's used to build and maintain local roads. You might use some of these roads, but not all of them. Or perhaps you don't drive at all. But we assume that you're going to get some benefit, even from the roads you don't use, and even if you don't drive at all, because the goods and services that you buy are going to be delivered by other people who are going to use those roads. So you're going to get some indirect benefit from them. Likewise, we assume that you get a general benefit from public schools, even if you don't have children who are attending them. Having an educated public is good for everybody.
Sure.
So we say, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
So that's a tax, a general payment for a general benefit. A fee is more like a price. In other words, it's a specific payment for a specific benefit or to defray a specific cost that you impose on others.
Okay.
For example, when you pay a roadway toll or a parking meter, that's a fee. You're paying, again, we talked earlier about water or electricity. You pay per unit consumed, right?
Yeah.
So these are fees. When we pay our taxes, it appears to many of us that our money kind of just disappears out into the void. We have no idea where it goes. And we're generally not aware of what we're getting in return. And this tends to breed resentment. And as a result, over the last 50 or 40 years, there's been a lot of what we call tax revolts because people feel that they're paying taxes, they don't know that they're getting any benefit, and they're angry about that. On the other hand, people tend to be more accepting of fees because they feel like, oh, yeah, I'm paying this per gallon fee for water, but yeah, I drank or flushed that many gallons of water, so I can see a connection. between
Logical
what I'm paying and what I'm getting. It seems like a fair exchange.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, an important distinction. And I think, getting back to this distinction, it's interesting that if you're a politician, people will vote you out of office if you increase the gas tax by a penny, right? Now, the price of gas can go up by 50 cents or $1 a gallon over a year. And when you ask people about that, they go, oh, well, that's the price of gas. What can you do? So they're furious about the politician who charges them a penny, but when the private sector raises the price or lowers the price by 50 cents or $1, well, it's a price.
Yeah.
So fees are more like prices and therefore probably more acceptable. Because land, now I'm going to come back to why this distinction is important.
Yeah.
Land values reflect the combined value of all the public goods and services that are provided to a particular location. So that makes land value return more like a fee than a tax. And because it's a fee, perhaps we could even get tax-exempt organizations to pay their fair share. After all, tax-exempt organizations pay for water and pay for electricity, right? They don't say, oh, I'm a charity or I'm a religious institution, therefore I don't pay for water and electricity. No, they do. Well, likewise, they should pay their fair share for other public goods and services. Mm-hmm. And because it's not some general vague benefit in exchange for some vague general payment, but this is a specific payment for a specific benefit, it would be more fair. And if everybody paid their fair share, I think that would be more fair.
Yes, it would. That makes eminent sense, of course. And when you do think of the charitable institutions that are exempt from tax, that means they're not chipping in for the fire service, police service, sewer, on and on. So that's a great point. So we're getting, I think, to the end of this conversation, at least. I hope we have some more. But upon reaching that conclusion, what do you think about the hard realities of politics and influence? We're listening to you, talking about a great idea. How do we get it done? What about the fear of trying something new, which is endemic today in public political debate?
Well, I think as for the fear of trying something new, I tend to remind folks that there's nothing new about land value return and recycling. Mm-hmm. After all, we're already doing it today. We're just not doing it very much. But everybody who's paying a property tax, part of that tax is based on the privately created value of your building. Mm-hmm. Part of it's based on the publicly created value of your land. So we're doing it today, but we're putting too much tax on privately created value, which exacerbates the housing affordability problem and the lack of jobs. We're doing too much of that and too little of returning publicly created value to the public. So we're not doing something new. We're doing something that we're already doing. Just, again, getting the balance, in my mind, to be more appropriate. And to the extent that we're getting a bigger return from publicly created land values, this should allow us to reduce the tax on privately created building values. And this should be very popular with both politicians and the public. And while this is, as I've described it, a tax shift, if you're a politician and you go to the public, say, oh, I've got a great idea, here's a new tax. Well, that's dead on arrival. It doesn't matter how good it is. If you say, I've got a new tax, forget about it. And if you say, oh, I've got a great idea, I'm going to shift taxes. Well, most people are going to think, well, you're just taking it out of one pocket and putting it up. And that doesn't go over well. But because by getting a fair land value return and recycling, we could reduce the tax on everybody's buildings, I would refer to this, and I think you've referred to it this way sometimes, as a universal tax abatement. I mean, what would be more popular than a concept called the universal tax abatement? Because every property owner is going to get a tax reduction regarding any buildings that they may own. And unlike the current system where the politically powerful can get a tax abatement, but everybody else can't, This would be a universal tax abatement. In other words, everybody would get it. Now, the shift that we're talking about, it should occur gradually over years. And by doing it this way, you avoid creating windfalls and wipeouts. And this is not only fair, because windfalls and wipeouts aren't fair, and that's not the point of this reform, but by doing it gradually, we allow landowners to shift their behavior so that they can take advantage of new incentives. So instead of being winners and losers, everybody could be a winner. And if land value return is sufficiently robust, as we said, other taxes on labor and capital can be reduced. And as we know, if you tax things that move, like labor and capital, those things tend to move to lower jurisdiction and to lower tax jurisdictions. And this creates a race to the bottom, where in order to be competitive, everybody tries to have the lowest tax rate to attract investment. And that just makes all the jurisdictions poor. And so a big advantage of taxing land is that it does not move.
That's it for this edition of Smart Talk. And we'd like to thank Rick Rybeck. For more information on this and any other episodes, please visit our website at henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Joshua Vincent, and thank you very much for watching Smart Talk.